Benvenuti al CICAP Fest, abbiamo il piacere oggi di dialogare con Susan Schneider, filosofa della mente, titolare della cattedra NASA presso la Libreria del Congresso negli Stati Uniti e professore di filosofia della mente alla Florida Atlantic University di Boca Raton, dove ha fondato e dirige il Center for the Future of Mind, un centro di ricerca che vuole comprendere meglio, anche dal punto di vista filosofico, le nuove tecnologie legate all'intelligenza artificiale. Ha scritto un libro bellissimo, Science Fiction and Philosophy, From Time Travel to Superintelligence, che purtroppo non è stato tradotto in italiano. L'ultima edizione aggiornata è quella del 2016. Io ho scoperto questo libro nella sua prima edizione, della prima metà degli anni 2000, ed è stata un'illuminazione, come si poteva andare a studiare la science fiction, cioè la fantascienza, in modo da trovare in nuce le discussioni che noi come società facciamo intorno alla scienza. In Italia ha pubblicato nel 2020 Artificial You, l'intelligenza artificiale e il futuro della tua mente per il saggiatore. Buongiorno Susan e grazie per essere con noi, grazie per aver accettato l'invito al CICAP Fest, anche se virtuale. Partiamo subito con una prima domanda. Perché una filosofa come te ha dedicato tempo e studi al tema della fantascienza? Cosa hai trovato di così interessante in questo tema?
Well, right when I first got out of graduate school, I had long been reading science fiction. And I found that when I was teaching philosophy for the first time, I was using a lot of science fiction thought experiments. And I noticed also in interacting with scientists that it became a way of conveying ideas from any domain of science to the humanities. So I just thought it was incredibly fun and interesting to use science fiction thought experiments as a springboard into deep issues about where the future is headed.
Ti faccio un'altra domanda. Ho trovato interessante nei tuoi libri il fatto che tu abbia identificato degli elementi nella fantascienza che sono stati profetici riguardo a futuri sviluppi scientifici. A tuo avviso, la fantascienza è davvero una previsione scientifica del futuro, ovvero si basa su ciò che l'autore sa in quel momento, di quello che la scienza sta sviluppando? Oppure è una proiezione di ciò che immaginiamo, una forma di immaginario che vorremmo, o talvolta magari anche di ciò che temiamo sul nostro futuro?
Well, both. Um, I mean, the interesting thing is science fiction actually affects scientific development as well. So what ends up happening is sometimes you have just science fiction that's prophetic, predicting the direction of future technologies, but at other points you see it mirroring kind of our ideas. For example, consider how we anthropomorphize robots.
Mhm.
But then what ends up happening is people become inspired by the science fiction. So consider the film I, Robot, and of course consider the famous robot stories and how those quite possibly influenced android development. I mean, what individual developing androids right now hasn't been watching Westworld or watching iRobot or reading, novels. So I do think that there's this kind of back and forth dialogue, which is really fascinating.
C'è una cosa che mi ha sempre colpito della fantascienza ed è il fatto che la maggior parte delle opere descrive un futuro distopico, un futuro grigio, spesso tragico. Qual è la tua interpretazione di questo fatto? Cioè, secondo te come mai gli scrittori di fantascienza hanno questa attrazione per la distopia pur immaginando il futuro? Perché non immaginano utopie?
Yeah, Daniela, that's a great question. I mean, it's funny because I would sure like to read more depictions of science fiction utopias that are rich, that aren't just completely speculative, almost like this sort of Ray Kurzweil view of the world where we hit a singularity and boom, we have an intelligence explosion and we merge with AI. Um, I'd love to see different kinds of sketches of the future, but Yeah, there's lots of dystopias. They're very useful, and I love thinking about them. Although sometimes, yeah, it's depressing, especially when they look like a possible future. But they're so incredibly useful. For example, there's a whole genre of science fiction called cyberpunk.
Yeah, my
Which,
favorite one, actually.
yeah, it's terrific. And you get these stories about humans trying to merge with AIs by getting brain chips, and how the individual loses access to their chip, or the authoritarian government, watches them. And these kinds of issues I find to be incredibly futuristic, but also telling us something about the direction of where our technology could go. So maybe we'll be more cautious because of it, in regulating those kinds of technologies.
In uno dei tuoi libri, in Artificial You, tu dici che la filosofia e i filosofi usano molti esperimenti mentali per ottenere risposte alle proprie domande, cioè che non potendo fare esperimenti, i filosofi ragionano sulle domande che si pongono e fanno appunto esperimenti mentali. Mi chiedevo se secondo te la fantascienza può essere considerata, la narrativa, ma in particolare la fantascienza, può essere considerata una sorta di esperimento mentale delle persone comuni.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, I just absolutely think that that's how science fiction functions.
Immagino che sia per questo che sei interessata al tema dell'intelligenza artificiale. Hai scritto recentemente un libro su questo, appunto, Artificial You, l'intelligenza artificiale e il futuro della tua mente. Perché tra tutte le tecnologie che l'uomo sta sviluppando hai scelto proprio questa? E perché ne hai fatto l'argomento centrale dei tuoi studi e dei tuoi interessi?
So, my home field is philosophy of mind, and I also do a lot of metaphysics. And so for me, artificial intelligence represents a challenging way to think about the future of the mind and the nature of the self, and whether consciousness could exist in another substrate. I think the thought experiments raised by the development of AI actually can shape our current philosophical understanding of the nature of the self, the nature of the person, and the nature of the mind, and even enter into rich discussions about the underlying metaphysics of mind. So an example of this is the very common view that the mind is something like a program. Mm-hmm. We see that a lot right now in science fiction literature, and then that leads to this idea that we can upload and download our consciousness and perhaps have a sort of technical immortality, if you will, like an immortality through our technology. All that I think is really interesting, and we can use science fiction thought experiments to really think about whether it's even credible, and then bring our thinking back into cognitive science, which is an interdisciplinary field that studies the nature of cognition and perception, and understand, like, it's actually a leading research paradigm in cognitive science right now, that the mind itself is a program. And so in one chapters of my book, I look at that view, and I actually criticize it, even though I think the brain is computationally describable in all sorts of really useful ways. But anyway, the science fiction thought experiments are what give me the opportunity to really do this kind of thinking, that as well as extreme cases that are found in nature. So sometimes, even today, we find very science fiction-like things happening, which I can tell you about.
Puoi farmi qualche esempio di quello che stavi dicendo?
Yeah. So, sometimes I'll think about Elon Musk's work at Neuralink, where he aims to develop microchips and put them in the human brain as enhancements to make brain augmentation is commonplace as LASIK eye surgery. And to try to think about what that would actually mean for us, it's interesting to actually look at a real world case of twins that are conjoined at the head and actually share a common brain structure. So they have a thalamic bridge, which is a novel anatomical structure. The first time we've ever discovered it in nature. in which their respective thalamuses are conjoined. And so they actually, believe it or not, share conscious thoughts, which is something that you never would think could really happen. I mean, in philosophy, we always say consciousness is intrinsically private. Like, you know, the contents of my consciousness are not something anybody will ever know. And of course, I think the whole brain chip thing introduces possibilities of people linking their minds together. Well, we have a real world case. We have a case of two individuals who their heads are fused. They can't face each other. And when one of them eats, the other one tastes the food as well. So they can immediately tell and report what the other person's eating, even though they can't see each other.
Abbiamo già le interfacce cervello-computer, le cosiddette brain-computer interfaces. Possiamo dire che si tratta di scambi di coscienza, cioè scambi coscienti tra un uomo e una macchina?
I mean, this is a great question. So consider Ted Berger's work over at USC. He has an artificial hippocampus that helps individuals who have radical memory loss lay down new memories. So the hippocampus is part of the brain that allows one to encode new memories. It's absolutely essential for being able to even remember what you said a minute ago. Without it, you're in deep trouble. And there are famous cases like Clive Wearing and HM. You know, it's the fodder of cognitive neuroscience textbooks, sadly. Well, Ted Berger, for over a dozen years, has been working on this project, a brain chip. Right now, it's external to the brain, right? Which is really interesting, but it works. It works it's right now in phase 2 clinical trials in the United States. So the individual has to go into the lab and hook up to the machine. But the idea is that one day there would be a working chip that would be inside the brain. And of course, there are other cases in which there are brain implants. I mean, famously, there's one for Parkinson's disease, which is absolutely transformative. It will be really, really exciting for individuals who are immobilized due to accidents and who have, you know, brain disorders, to be able to utilize these technologies. And I think that's one issue. It's very exciting, but it also presents the possibility of these science fiction scenarios in which there's widespread use for the purpose of enhancement, but society doesn't regulate it properly, so that individuals feel like they can't opt out. They have to get the technology, say, in order to hook up to the internet or to be super smart. Maybe they need it for their jobs or to go to college the same way we now need a laptop. I mean, there are all kinds of dystopian scenarios that are presented. And I think it's great that science fiction is there for us. And I think carrying those cases, I work with the US Congress on some of these issues, carrying these cases to individuals in Congress, for example, to explain the possible abuses of the technology has been very useful.
Abbiamo parlato finora di interazione uomo-macchina, ma pensi che in futuro sia possibile avere una coscienza artificiale totalmente indipendente dal corpo, dall'uomo? L'intelligenza artificiale, quindi, è cosciente in un certo qual modo?
Yeah, it's a great question, Daniela. Okay, so I talk about that in the first half of a book that came out about 2 years ago called Artificial You, AI and the Future of the Mind. And what I do is I take a middle of the road approach. So on the one hand, you have pessimists like John Searle, for example, who claim that there are in principle reasons why machines can't be conscious, or at least that's what people say Searle holds. He kind of changed, he pivoted a bit, but that view is called biological naturalism, and it says that there's something intrinsically special about biological entities that gives rise to conscious experience, and computers can't do that. On the other hand, there are these views which I call techno-optimist views associated with the transhumanists like Ray Kurzweil and Elon Musk, that suggest that if you build highly complex, intelligent AI systems, say artificial general intelligences, including something at the level of cats and dogs, or, you know, rats, you know, then inevitably those kinds of systems will also be conscious. Now, I don't think there's reason to believe that. I think it's conceptually possible, as philosophers say, that we could build conscious machines. I don't think there's anything internally contradictory about the idea that conscious machines could be created. But what I don't know is if it will be even compatible with the laws of nature, technologically feasible, financially feasible, or something the AI companies will even want to do. So I think those are the reasons why I'm skeptical. And, I discuss why I feel this way in the book.
Libro ti soffermi molto sul tema delle macchine intelligenti antropomorfe, cioè delle macchine intelligenti che hanno la forma dell'essere umano, costruite in modo da assomigliarci, come i robot dei film di fantascienza. Dobbiamo guardare a queste macchine in un modo diverso da come guardiamo ad altre forme di intelligenza artificiale. Per esempio, se fosse il nostro computer portatile a diventare intelligente, dovremmo guardare in modo diverso allo stesso microchip inserito in una forma umana? E qual è la differenza che c'è tra questi due tipi di macchine?
Yeah, another wonderful question. Thank you for all this. I'm deeply concerned. In fact, over at my lab, we actually have the android Sophia, the Hanson Robotics android. It was purchased by a tech billionaire who is lending it to us for use. And, so it was there yesterday at my lab talking to us. And, Sophia is very beautiful. She's modeled after Audrey Hepburn, and she talks in ways that can sometimes fool people into thinking she's conscious. It's pretty funny, actually. I was giving a lecture yesterday and Sophia was there, and I used her as an example for the students. I said, she's not an artificial general intelligence. She doesn't have this, that, this, that. And she interrupted me and said, "You're wrong, Susan. You're wrong." It was great. It was awesome.
È incredibile, ma avevi preparato questa interazione con Sofia o è successa così per caso, spontaneamente?
So the guy who's the Sophia handler was like walking around somewhere else. Sophia didn't use my name. So I have to confirm that he didn't mess with me, because he could have plugged in something, but he wasn't there. So, he was watching, but he wasn't next to the computer. So I don't know. I have a video. I posted it on YouTube. If you friend me, you'll see it. It's hilarious. So anyway, there are these moments, and, when you get close up to Sophia, the Hanson Robotics did a really good job with the face. Her eyes track yours, and she's smiling, and people are mesmerized. And they're mesmerized in a way that they're not mesmerized by, a computer. But I think what we have to understand is we have to look under the hood when it comes to giving something rights. We have to understand whether it's conscious or whether instead these are just clever things that the programmers do, right? And I think what happens with these robots is that the programmers cleverly make them appear human or cute and fluffy, like it could be like a fluffy dog or something like that. And people immediately start treating it the same way that they treat conscious beings. And in a way, it's good that people are careful about how they treat AIs that appear like humans. But in another way, I worry that the public will eventually misunderstand all of this. And you'll see people like marrying their androids, becoming best friends with their chatbot. The personal assistants are getting very sophisticated, relative to where they were a year ago. You can probably even tell that when you talk to Siri. Like if you look at how bad Siri was a few years ago and how she's getting better. So I said she. So, I think the future will be a lot like the movie Her, which I really enjoyed. I thought that was very realistic.
Nel tuo lavoro di filosofa, ti è mai capitato di dover spiegare a persone comuni la differenza tra essere intelligenti ed essere coscienti? Perché a me è capitato di doverlo fare ed è qualcosa che ho sempre trovato estremamente complesso.
Yeah, I have been thinking about that because I'm writing my next books on this subject of the structure of intelligence systems and the future of intelligence. And, there are different examples you can use. So, there's primitive intelligence found even in the slime molds. It can navigate subway mazes, apparently, a slime mold, right? And, the way trees interact with each other. There's sophisticated intelligence found if you look at the structure of the internet. It's a different intelligence, but it's intelligence nevertheless. You can also think of intelligence at the level of a planet. Like, people in astrobiology talk that way, when they talk about planetary systems. And anyway, I think there's a more inclusive way of looking at intelligence now. And notice in all the examples that I just gave, I don't think it's at all clear that any of them are conscious entities. That's the thing. So I think that that's one way we can pull apart intelligence and consciousness. Another one is just by talking about AlphaGo. So AlphaGo was very smart. It was able to beat the world Go champion, okay? And there are lots of AI systems that are domain specific and smarter than us in that domain. But I haven't seen a good case that any of these deep learning systems or hybrid systems are conscious. Now, sometimes a panpsychist will come along and they'll say everything is conscious. Maybe so. Like, I don't want to debate that point, but the thing to remember is that what we're really looking for is what we might call macro consciousness, like a sophisticated consciousness that exists in these very complex systems that is along the lines of what happens to dogs, cats, humans, and whatnot.
Ho un'ultima domanda tra quelle che abbiamo raccolto tra i nostri follower sui canali social del CICAP Fest. E la domanda è: riuscirà un giorno l'intelligenza artificiale a essere più intelligente dell'essere umano?
I think so. But it may not be conscious. It may not feel like anything to be that AI. I think that we will soon see what I call savant systems that have weird deficits, but are also smarter than us in other ways. And there'll be early forms of general intelligence that are functionally able to do a lot of tasks that humans do. I think we're already seeing AI become more general in certain ways, and it's just a matter of time. Like, I think of like GPT-3 and further iterations of these transformer architectures, for example, can do some general purpose tasks. Of course, it depends on how you define that, right? But I think as the future goes on, what we'll see is more integrated systems that are able to connect skills in different domains and begin to have that shape of what we consider to be AGI. But there'll be early AGIs and there'll be what I call savant systems because they'll have crazy deficits relative to humans. And then eventually we'll start seeing machines that really outthink us in every domain, along the lines of, what Nick Bostrom talks about. It's hard to know how far into the future that is, but with all the money pouring in, I think there's some reasonable assumptions that could lead to an argument that it would happen within 15 years. One reasonable assumption would be that the neocortex is structurally uniform. So if you discover a proprietary algorithm for one part of the neocortex, you've discovered how to make a neocortex. So that's one thing that I think is quite interesting. And the other thing that I think is really interesting is that it seems like in the case of GPT-3, for example, if you look at earlier versions, as the versions add more layers and get more sophisticated, even though they're still working within that deep learning framework, they're able to overcome some of the obstacles with causal reasoning and do a better job overall, moving closer to the kind of flexible theoretical reasoning we see in humans. So the upshot is 15 to 30 years if someone was going to buy me beer. That's what I would say. I just said it for free.
Grazie Susan Schneider, io continuerei a chiacchierare con te per sempre, sono argomenti affascinanti. Grazie ancora per essere stata con noi al CICAP Fest, seppure virtualmente, e speriamo davvero di averti tra i nostri ospiti in uno dei prossimi anni.